now that we've had a basic intro to functions, let's go one step further and talk about functions with parameters and also functions with return values. So we'll switch on over to main activity and we're just going to kind of continue on where we left off here. So I talked briefly about how we could improve our move function by adding in a parameter. What a parameter allows us to do is pass in values when we call upon the function, and then we can use those values within the function body itself. So when we're implementing our function, we use these parameters as kind of placeholders to help us perform some functionality, and they don't actually take value until we pass them in when we're calling on the function. So let me just run through a quick way in which we can improve this function by passing in a new change or a new position. Okay, so we're going to create another move function. Okay, and actually, weirdly enough, we can have the same name as long as either the return value or the parameters that are passed in are different. So in this case, I'm going to have something like by amount, which is going to be of type integer. Okay, so note how there is no longer an issue because although these functions have the same name, this is taking in a parameter, this is not. And now I'm going to say player position plus equals by amount. Okay, so kind of weird wording, I know, but it makes a bit more sense when we call on the function. So now what this is doing is it's going to kind of work like before. It's going to increase our player position by a certain amount. This time, rather than it being a static 2 every single time, we'll be able to pass in some amount and we'll increase our player position by that. So now we can increase our player position by 1, 2, 3. We can even make the player go backwards by increasing it by a negative amount. And this will allow us to finally control exactly how much we want our player to move by. Now within the function body itself, by amount doesn't take on any value. It's just kind of a placeholder. It only takes a value on when we call upon the move function and then we pass in some value. So let's say we want to move our player forwards by 5. Okay, it's going to say by amount 5, and now our player position, let's pretend we never called upon this, our player position is going to be equal to 5. Similarly, if we passed in a negative 5, our player position is now negative 5, and so on and so forth. So this just improves our function a bit more by allowing extra functionality and allowing us finer control over exactly how much we want to increase our position by. Now we can go one step further than this by actually returning a value. So actually, before I talk about return values, I should mention we're not just restricted to integers as far as passing parameters in goes. We can have stuff like strings, doubles, booleans, etc. We can even pass in entire objects or lists or arrays of objects. So parameters can also take on the form of lists or objects, and in fact very often do. Okay, so coming back to return values. Now we found a way to pass values in, but not retrieve values as output. So that's where return values come in handy. We generally specify the type up here, so let's say boolean, or maybe the type is going to be a string or an integer. This is where we specify the type of return value, and then at some point in the function we'll want a return statement. So we'll just say return and then some value that corresponds with the type. For example, let's say we want to return a boolean type value, then at some point we're going to have to return false or return true. Okay, and whether or not we want to use this value is entirely up to us, but let's just say that we do. So what we're going to do in our scenario is check to see after the player has moved whether this is a valid position or not. So a good implementation might be something like, before we check to see if we move the player forwards, we check to see if it's a valid move, and if it's not a valid move, then we just don't move that player forwards. So why don't we do something like that? Within our function here, we're going to check to see if we have made a valid move. So we'll say something like if player position plus by amount is greater than some value, and actually let's have something like a val max position be an int, and we'll set this equal to, let's say 10, and we'll have a val min position of type int equal to 0. So we'll say something like if the player position plus by amount is greater than our max position, or, and I'm just going to copy this here, save a bit of time, let's just paste that, and we're going to say player position plus by amount is going to be less than our min position. Okay, so if either of these cases are true, we want to return false. Okay, so we're going to say return false. The reason being that we're clearly out of bounds if either of these cases is true. Otherwise, we're going to return true. But before we do, we'll want to actually increase our player position by that certain amount. Okay, so keep in mind that although this is exhaustive in this case because we have an if and an else case, but if we didn't have an else case, then we'd need some kind of a default return value at the end. But because we're covering both cases, we can, and don't worry about that, we can just return false or return true within these if statements. Okay, so now things are getting a little more complicated. We're basically checking to see if we move out of bounds. This logic is fairly straightforward. If you need a second, then just pause this and read over that. And basically, if we're out of bounds, we're going to return false. We'll say that we cannot make that movement. Otherwise, we're going to return true, and we're going to make that movement. So now what we can do is actually return a value, retrieve a value from it, and we can create a val saying is valid move equal to the results of this. So is valid move, let's just capitalize that, is going to contain true or false depending on whether that move was valid or not. In our case, our player position is 0, and we're trying to move backwards by 5. That's not going to be a valid move, so this will take on the value of false, and our player position won't change. If we try to increase the position by 5, this is a valid move, so will take on the value of true, and we're going to increase our player position by 5. Alright, so actually pretty simple, retrieving values. Just be sure that if you do have a return type, you have to return a value of that particular type at some point in the function's iteration. You always have to return a value, so generally speaking, it's good practice just to return some kind of a default value such as false. Okay? Just like before, the return type is not limited to booleans. We can return whatever value we want, and we can use that value just like we would any other variable or constant like we see here. Okay, so now we've covered parameters and return values. That's all you really need for a basic intro into functions. There's a lot more I could talk about when it comes to functions, but unfortunately I'm trying to hurry things along, as I think by this point we're already over an hour. So we can switch to the next topic now, which is going to be classes and objects. We covered how to pass in values through parameters, and also when we're calling on the functions, and retrieve values out as return values. And so as always, I would encourage you to play around with this a little bit more. Once you're comfortable with this and ready to move on, we'll start learning about classes and objects.